Few things tonight uh, about Justice and Beyond. Know that we've been doing this organizing for a decade now as we come together on this platform since the pandemic. We are happy to be able to bring together more people, but we operate and are able to do this by the pillars who are individual people or organizations that have come alongside each other to say we want to make Justice and Beyond happen every Monday. And so we have a Tuesday meeting at about 4:30. And then we talk about the upcoming forum that we'll have and upcoming forums that can be put on the calendar, and we help organize that. So I want to thank all the pillars. And if you want to be a pillar, just show up. Show up at 4:30 by this very same Zoom link and help us get this going, help us organize together. And so as we come together on tonight, we know that Zoom bombing is a very real thing. Unfortunately, it still happens. And so, if at any time during this conversation and this presentation that we have tonight, if we are Zoom bombed, we will immediately shut down this Zoom. And then we ask that you just go right back in and log back in and get back on and join us again, believing that we have eliminated the problem. But no, if anything of that happens, we'll just shut down immediately and get back on. All right. With that said, we are so excited tonight to have Stella here tonight from the Independent Police Monitor to give us information about the consent decree and how all of us, once we are educated, can get involved to make our voices known as to where we stand and where we should stand in the consent decree. And so, with that said, Stella, welcome and thank you so much for giving up your time to be here with us tonight. For those who may not know you, first, just start off by giving us some information about yourself and about your work, and then go into your presentation, please.
Yes, of course. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. My name is Stella Cziment. I'm the independent police monitor for the city of New Orleans. I am effectively the executive director of our local oversight office here. So the Office of the Independent Police Monitor, again, we're the local oversight. We're not the federal monitors. We existed before the consent decree, and we will exist after. We have a broader mandate than I would say the federal monitors have. We have more responsibilities. And one component of that is engaging with the community. And that is something that I believe we do differently than the federal monitors do. I'll be highlighting more about our work and everything that we do in the presentation that I'll be going through. I'm a very informal presenter, so if there's questions, please feel free to ask or just drop them in the chat and I'll try to respond to them as I see them or as I hear them. Just in case anyone's curious about my personal history, I'm from California originally, the other Los Angeles. I've lived here for 16 years. I went to Tulane Law School, and then I worked for the Louisiana Commission on Human Rights, the Orleans Public Defenders, the Recovery School District, and the Orleans Parish School Board, and then here. So I've gotten to see the criminal legal system in a lot of different capacities, and that's what kind of drove me to wanting to work in police oversight. And I love this job. Okay, so with that, I'm going to start this presentation because we're at an exciting time. And I know it's also a time that might be worrisome for some because the end of the consent decree is a big legal step, but also it is a symbolic one as well. And I want to be very sensitive to that. So I'm going to talk about the consent decree and oversight in New Orleans. I am going to talk a lot about things that are outside of the consent decree, only because, again, on the night of this election, on the night of a lot of potential change and a lot of uncertainty, I kind of want to assure people that whether the consent decree exists or not, there's going to be a lot of legal safeguards in place that are not going anywhere. So I just kind of want to make sure that people understand that the landscape is big. It's far larger than just the consent decree. All right, so We'll jump through this. First, we're going to talk about the role of the Office of the Independent Police Monitor, just to provide some context. Again, we kind of have three pillars of work. We ensure compliance and reform, we amplify the needs of the community, and we make the NOPD a safer and non-discriminatory workplace. Now, by achieving those three goals, we do a lot of work that falls into those categories. That includes doing audits and report writing. We run a community police mediation program that I know some of your membership is a part of, and we greatly appreciate that. But it is available for the community and for police officers to be able to go through mediation in lieu of a formal misconduct investigation. We monitor all of the disciplinary proceedings. We go to the Use of Force Review Board as an advisory member. We're a member of the Policy Advisory Committee and the Training Advisory Committee for the NOPD. We provide countless recommendations to the NOPD in terms of their policy and how they operate. We're on call 24 hours a day, every day of the week, including holidays for any officer-involved shootings or critical incidents that might occur. And we go out to the scene and we monitor the full force investigation from start to finish. We take complaints of officer misconduct and we prepare referral letters that we send to the Public Integrity Bureau for investigation. We also take accounts of positive policing, which we call accommodations. We now run the Monitors Mic, which is a radio show that's on WBOK at noon on Fridays, where we talk about policing, oversight, and community issues as a way to kind of ensure that we're informing and equipping our community to have safe and productive encounters with the NOPD and to navigate the policing space. So this is where we exist in the city structure. I just wanted to briefly let you know that both my office and the Office of the Inspector General reports to the Ethics Review Board. We're totally separate from the NOPD, who reports to the mayor. And I just wanted to highlight that whenever there's concerns about a city agency, I know there's always questions of independence. So this is where we fall in the city structure. So we have as much independence as I think is possible for being a city employee. These are all the different laws that govern our work, but also make requirements of us. Again, I highlight all of this just to be clear that none of those things are the consent decree. So when the consent decree disappears, there's still going to be the legal framework that enables our office to exist. That said, the consent decree does definitely help us because having the voice of the federal government is always helpful with navigating any complications that might exist if, say, state government passes a law to ban local oversight, which was an issue in Florida this last year, actually, and starting on July 1st of this summer, all civilian oversight offices were dismantled in Florida due to a state law. That was 21 civilian oversight offices, and something similar happened last year in Tennessee. So that is a very real reality that we're always trying to weigh and consider. And it is something that is on our mind as we discuss the possible end of the consent decree, because the exit of the federal voice will create opportunities for state government to step in if they so choose to. So let's talk about civilian oversight in New Orleans and our local legal history. There are three reasons why you're typically going to have oversight or monitors in my type of capacity. And the first reason is that it's court ordered. So the court can order it through litigation that's brought by the US Department of Justice. And so that would be called like a pattern and practice piece of legislation. They would go forward and they would say there's a pattern and practice of certain policing behavior that is concerning to us, that's violating civil rights. So that's one avenue that's available in lieu of, say, a consent decree. And the court might, as part of that litigation, order that there be a court-appointed monitor to be able to monitor that policing practice while this litigation is underway. Now, there's consent decree monitors. Those monitors are appointed after there's a consent decree in place. And those monitors are going to be a collection of vendors who put forth a contract. So in our situation, it was Shepherd Mullins, a law firm out of Washington, D.C. And they put together a team. They bid on the contract. It was like an RFP. They bid on it and they received the contract to be able to monitor the consent decree. Their role is going to be dictated by the consent decree. There's like literal requirements, paragraphs that say what's expected of the federal monitors and what they're expected to do to execute their contract. Now, this has been historically an issue of some tension, and now it's something that has been discussed in some public forums recently with issues around potential conflict of our federal monitors. I can go deeper into that if there's interest, or we could just move on. It's just whatever the group kind of wants. So if there's interest in me talking about those issues, we can. Yeah. Edith, did you have a question?
Yes, I definitely have interest in talking about that.
Oh, okay.
Just letting you know I'm part of Ion Surveillance as well, so working on that as well.
Great. Okay. Well, then you're very familiar with it. So the conflict issue that we're seeing here is that the consent decree has a paragraph, and I can look up the exact number. I believe it's 462. I'll check the exact paragraph. But basically, it requires that the federal monitors disclose if they're going to enter into certain financial agreements with individuals that will influence the parties of the consent decree. It's a pretty basic boilerplate language about legal conflicts, the idea that you don't want to have a legal conflict, especially as a monitor over the consent decree. Now, again, this is a very basic legal concept that when you have a contract and then you have someone who's meant to be the referee of that contract, you want to make sure that that referee is not being influenced through any type of financial means or any type of personal gain. The issue that has come to light here is that over the course of the last 11 or so years that we've had this relationship with Shepard Mullins, the two lead attorneys from Shepard Mullins who are overseeing the federal monitoring team, Jonathan Arney and David Douglas, have both entered into side projects, or I would say like other forms of employment maybe, that have touched on policing issues and have actually involved them forming relationships with NOPD employees, former NOPD employees, and city employees and former city employees through the course of those projects. So Jonathan Arney started ABLE. He was one of the co-founders of ABLE. ABLE is a program that exists out of Georgetown University now. And the basic premise is to teach bystander and EPIC training to interested individuals. He put on the board of advisors current NOPD employees. Now, those NOPD employees are not employed by ABLE. They do not receive any money from ABLE, but ABLE does facilitate some of those people going to conferences or training or leading trainings where they might receive compensation. So it's kind of like a middleman. The other thing is that like they do receive other professional benefits from being on the board of ABLE. And so Jonathan Arney, utilizing those individuals on his board, could bring a conflict into question. Now, in the case of the deputy federal monitor, so the number 2, that's David Douglas. David Douglas is the founding creator of ALIFA, which is Effective Law Enforcement for All. ALIFA is was created to advise and to basically be consultants that could receive contracts from other law enforcement agencies that are trying to, say, get ahead of a consent decree by addressing some potentially problematic policing practices, or they could be retained as subject matter experts by other federal monitoring teams or local oversight offices or communities to come in and advise on policing or oversight issues. They bid on the contract to be the federal monitors for the consent decree in Minneapolis in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. They went through a rigorous selection process during which David Douglas appeared on the televised proposal presentations as talking about the work he was doing with NOPD and with our consent decree. And he disclosed that he has hired a handful of former city employees, many of which held leadership positions with the NOPD, including Chief Harrison, who was the former chief of the NOPD and is still a current consultant to the district attorney's office, or contractor to the district attorney's office, and the former Public Integrity Bureau deputy chief, Arlendo Westbrook, the former head of the Office of Police Secondary Employment. And I believe he disclosed recently that he also hired a current NOPD captain, the captain of the homicide division, to be a subject matter expert on a contract that he is working on out of the Puerto Rico consent decree. So that has caused, again, a question of conflict. Does he have a conflict in being able to neutrally advise the court and to act as the court's eyes and ears on the consent decree if he's now forming business relationships and financial relationships with individuals who may have overseen that work before for the NOPD or are subject matters that he is supposed to be monitoring? So that is a question that only the court can answer. Only the parties of the consent decree can raise a conflict question like this. And ultimately, if the parties don't raise it, then I'm pretty sure the issue cannot be heard. Nobody else has standing to raise that issue. So if the Department of Justice or the City of New Orleans both feel that this is not an issue, then I guess it won't be addressed by the court. Edith, was there anything else about that you would like me to speak on?
No, that was great. And yeah, with Island Surveillance, we've been doing work of bringing this up. I think it's also good to mention about the public hearing last week where Ashley Burns, who's part of the monitor team, admitted, literally said I agree with community that there's big conflicts of interest. And literally said, to Douglas, you don't care about the people of New Orleans, you don't care about the people of Minneapolis. And so it is a big issue that our monitors, who are supposed to hold NOPD accountable to the consent decree, are cutting checks to the same people that they're supposed to be monitoring. So yeah, I think it's a huge issue, and on top of that, think about it's our tax money that are being paid as well to these monitors.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, if I was the judge, I would be asking a lot of questions and I'd be very concerned about some of the practices that has been disclosed. But, I think it's a legal question, but I will also add that it's a community concern. So totally separate from however the court decides to rule on it, or if the court decides not to hear it. It is, I think, a question that is important to the community to consider. And I do think it is fair to receive it as information and then to have that information color how maybe, say, you want to personally value the work and assessments being done by someone who you believe to have a conflict. I think that's a fair question to ask. And I think moving forward, communities across the country are asking similar questions because more communities are going under consent decrees, and as a result, more of them are putting conditions in place that their federal monitors can't have active contracts in other places as a result of some of these types of questions being asked. I mean, I know there's going to always be, as the Department of Justice framed it, cross-pollination issues, but this might be bigger than that. As always, New Orleans will probably be a leader / the, I don't know, the experimenting ground for these issues, unfortunately. And then there's going to be oversight agencies, going back to the slide, oversight agencies like my office, like the Office of the Inspector General. New Orleans has both of those things. So I'm not going to go through all of this New Orleans history. I just always think it's important to pay homage to the very real history that created the consent decree. I think people often talk about the consent decree as if that was the beginning of police reform. It was not the beginning of police reform. The community has been taking action in New Orleans around policing issues for years. I mean, like for decades. And if I really wanted to, I could find evidence that goes far beyond 1970. But I just started this from the 1970s, really the 1980s, just to do more of a recent snapshot because it's part of the community zeitgeist and collective memories. A lot of people were alive when this happened, lived through it, are aware of these issues, and they weigh on you. They do, because when you get pulled over by the NOPD or when you engage with the NOPD, you might be looking at that current officer as that current officer exists, or you might be looking at that officer and feeling the feelings you felt from NOPD in the 80s or NOPD in the 90s or the 70s or the early 2000s. And that information is going to influence the way you engage and the way you trust the officer that you're talking to. And that's something that I always talk to the NOPD about. I always explain to them that you have no idea what iteration of the NOPD you might represent to the community when you have an encounter, and you need to be respectful of that. Like, you might think like, oh, I shouldn't have to carry all of these things. These aren't my sins. But it is your legacy. Like it or not, it is you. They wore the same badge as you and everything else. And you have to be aware of those things existing. And same with the community on the other side is you have to be aware whenever the NOPD engages with you, they might be thinking about Officer Holloway, who died in the line of duty. So you never know what they're carrying into their interactions with you. So when I say oversight started long before the creation of my office or long before the consent decree was imagined, I mean it. In 1981, City Council voted to create the Office of Municipal Investigations, and that truly was the framework that created our office and created a lot of what we know oversight to be. And so I wanted to provide this timeline to kind of give some institutional memory to the idea of how oversight has existed and changed in this city. We've had a lot of different iterations of it. It was the report on police civilian review task force that ended up really kind of creating our iteration of the OIPM as we know it to be, and the Office of the Inspector General as we know it to be. So enter the consent decree. So again, the consent decree is the result of bad policing that the community experienced from the 1980s on. It was the result of a very comprehensive report that was done by the Federal Bureau of Investigations that found that the NOPD was truly corrupt, had criminal practices and associations, a lack of internal structure, a lack of credible leadership. There was no accountability. There was rampant use of force. There was the targeting of African Americans in our community, particularly African American boys. The NOPD received payouts. There were field strip searches of African American boys, like teenagers. Supervisors failed to take action to hold any of the patrol officers under their command in any type of accountability. And then there was discriminatory practices in terms of how the NOPD policed, but also there was discriminatory practices in terms of how the NOPD internally hired, promoted, and transferred people. So from all of that, in March 2011, the FBI presented their findings, and the NOPD effectively had the decision to make about whether or not they were entering into the consent decree. And by the NOPD, I mean really the city of New Orleans. So our federal consent decree is still the most expansive consent decree in the country. It goes after all of the topics of policing that you can imagine. So in some places, like say Warren, Ohio, they focus only on use of force. There might be a place where they're focusing only on discriminatory stops. There's a pattern and practice of police officers pulling over African Americans for traffic stops at a higher level than white residents. Or there might be just one issue around like language accessibility. However, here we truly were found to be in violation of it all. So our consent decree includes everything. Now, the hard part about our consent decree is the way that it's written. It includes very task-based language, like create a form, have your supervisor review your form within 72 hours, have your supervisor sign your form in this area. And when your supervisor reviews your form, make sure your form was not completed with a racist intent. And it's like that right there is not an easy to do logistical step. That is highly subjective. Now, anytime you have any type of requirement to eliminate bias, to eliminate discriminatory practices, you're going to get into some very tricky territory because, one, we're talking about a social science that changes. This is not a static concept. What we know about inherent bias and favoritism, discrimination, and racism, what we know about all of these things, and ableism and any other types of isms, has rapidly changed from, say, in 2012 when we were writing the consent decree. So it's really difficult for us to be able to determine, are we measuring things based on the standards that we set when we started the consent decree, or based on the standards that we should have today of police officers as we know policing to be in our current social structure? And that's a hard question to answer. And that's where I would say a really effective consent decree engages the community and incorporates changes and adapts and evolves. And then there's consent decrees that remain kind of static and follow the original language. This is kind of like the epic internal legal debate around the Constitution. Are you an originalist or do you believe it's a living document? I would say our consent decree is an originalist document. It is not a living document. It has not lived. Hence, things that do not evolve tend to not adapt, and things that do not adapt tend to die. Like, I sound like Charles Darwin now, but that just is how it tends to go. So it's important to keep the consent decree in mind in terms of our legal landscape. This is our legal landscape. I want you to map it out in your head whenever you think about policing in New Orleans and you think about the consent decree, and then your mind stops. It should open up to all of these other things, because all of these other things are stakeholders or legal guidelines or requirements that exist around the way that we police in New Orleans. So you can lift the consent decree out maybe, but these are all the things that you're still going to be touching and influencing whenever you change the way we police. I say this again as a way to kind of just provide some reassurance for anyone in the room who might be nervous about the idea of losing the consent decree, that you can't just like all of a sudden radically start making a lot of policing changes. But also I say it to anyone in the room who's thrilled about the end of the consent decree, that maybe hold your horses. You're not going to be able to see a rapid rollback of something because there are a lot of other factors at play. How many other factors? Here's an example. Say I wanted to change the way we do investigations. These here are all, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but these are all of the things that are triggered that have legal requirements around the way we do investigations. It includes the Civil Service Commission, which is their own legislative body and has the ability to pass their own laws. It includes, yes, the federal consent decree. It includes the Officer Bill of Rights, which is state law. It includes the Memorandum of Understanding between the District Attorney's Office and the State AG's office. It includes the OIG, which, and my office, and both of which are determined by the Home Rule Charter. It's going to trigger stuff in our memorandum of understanding with the NOPD, and then it's going to also require changes in NOPD's policies. And anytime you start tinkering with NOPD's policies, you might see the city council get involved. So there's a lot of different groups and laws that are touched by the way we do investigations, and similarly the way we do disciplinary hearings, the way we handle disciplinary appeals, and the way that we handle decertification of police officers. So it's very difficult to drop something in, like say you wanted a civilian oversight board and you wanted it to be created tomorrow. These are all the things that you would have to determine how to navigate through. And that's not to mean you can't navigate these things. You just have to know how to modify them. And in the last slide, we talked about, in the last slide, and I can provide this to Justice and Beyond membership. In the last slide, this is how you change all of those things if, say, you wanted to. Some require voter referendums. Some require a vote of 2/3 of elected members of the Louisiana House of Representatives. Some require modifications to the consent decree, and some require changes to civil service rules. So there's a lot of different things. So what are the differences between us and the federal monitors, otherwise known as OCDM? There's a handful of things. The main thing is how we're appointed, who we are. Like, I'm a New Orleans resident. Everyone in my office lives here, works here. We do more community-based events. We're not located out of Washington, D.C. We're paid through a designated amount of the general fund every single year. Even though we present to city council in theory can't like slash our funding. So if we had someone who was running with a very like political agenda, they could not do that in theory. And then because we're on site, we're able to be engaged very closely with the community and with the operations of the police department. So let's talk about the consent decree. We already briefly went over the different topics of the consent decree, but this is again where I highlight the consent decree is it's a legal document. That's it. It is a court-sanctioned agreement between the parties that ensures compliance with regulatory laws. It is a legal contract. So the question is if it's a legal contract, who represents the people of New Orleans? And my answer is unsatisfactory, but the answer is basically, technically, the Department of Justice does. But truly, no one does. Once you enter into the consent decree, the city is going to represent the municipality's interests. And those interests might be aligned with the community. You hope they're aligned with the community, but sometimes they're not. And then you have the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice is going to represent a legal concept of civil rights, but not necessarily the changing need or voice of a community. So they're going to have legal positions that they're going to put forth without ever talking to the community about those positions. That's not their job. So I know a lot of community groups, they filed motions to try to intervene and be named a party of the consent decree. Ultimately, Judge Morgan, back in 2013, when those motions were filed, denied all of them, including motions that were filed by police associations who felt that they were not adequately represented by the city of New Orleans or the NOPD either. And the answer was actually that the city of New Orleans is meant to represent all of those interests. So again, if you're concerned about conflict, that's a pretty big doozy because the city of New Orleans is asked to represent the interests of the municipality, which might sometimes be adverse to the interests of their own police department, which also might be adverse to the interests of their constituents, the people that actually live in the city. And that's one of the many reasons why a consent decree is not a constitution. A consent decree is really not a document that's meant to be for the community, but truly is this very legalistic thing. Otherwise, we would have more of a say in it. And it's just something worth highlighting and keeping in mind. So that way, I feel like I'm always such a Debbie Downer whenever I do this stuff, but I just really think expectation management is very important because I feel like people are not very honest about this work. And I feel it really does an injustice to the public, to the community, because I mean, I feel I was aware of the consent decree long before I started this work, and I felt deceived when I got this information. I was like, goodness. Oh, and sorry, this is a map that gives you an idea of all the different cities that are under consent decrees right now for many different reasons. Now they're under consent decrees or they're under some type of federal investigation. The different colors were symbolic of that. So here's a consent decree lifespan. Again, you prepare and write it, you enter into it, you do all the reform efforts, which as I described, some will be easy. Create a form, check. Some will be hard. Eliminate racism. That's going to be a tricky one. And then in theory, you reach full and effective compliance, and then you enter into sustainment, and then you exit the consent decree. There are other ways to exit a consent decree. You can file a motion to terminate a consent decree. And in this case, the city of New Orleans filed that motion. The judge has not ruled on that motion. That motion is still live. However, if we enter sustainment, then that motion will be moot, and the judge will rule on that. There's a lot of strategic reasons why it would be in the judge's best interest to go that tactic instead of, say, ruling on the motion and having the city appeal it to a higher court. So all of this stuff, again, is very legalistic. It's not about like necessarily like sitting here and weighing all of these things out. It might be there might be some legal decisions to be made. So in some municipalities, you can reach full and effective compliance on your individual chapters of the consent decree. And what they call that is findings of partial compliance. New Orleans, our federal judge has chosen not to go that tactic. So like say Seattle does partial compliance. New Orleans does compliance on all the chapters simultaneously. She does not want to start sustainment clocks at separate times. There are legal arguments for this model. There are legal arguments against this model. I will say that national best practice is starting to congeal around the idea of partial compliance findings, because that way you're able to move the areas that have reached compliance to more or less like a back burner and focus more attention and energy into the areas that still require that level of oversight. Now, all of that said, sustainment is a relatively new concept in the United States when it comes to policing consent decrees. So we frequently look to what tends to happen in other industries that are similarly situated to policing to decide how to handle these types of questions. So why do I frame it like that? Let me jump to that slide right now. These, by the way, are all the categories of, these are all the phases. So our federal monitors created like a color scheme, similar to like after 9/11. I talked about this with some people the other day and they didn't seem to remember. So maybe this is a bad analogy, but do you remember the color scheme that existed? We would wake up in the morning and be like, oh, I guess we're at alert orange. Like, who knows what that means? We're at orange for a terrorist attack. So it's like they created their own type of color scheme for how to measure these things. And they had no meaningful progress, inadequate progress, significant progress, nearing full and effective compliance, and full and effective compliance. Here's how they define these things. Nearing full and effective compliance means that you're nearing it. I love that definition that includes the actual language because it really clarifies. Or it means that you may have achieved compliance, but the Department of Justice or OCDM have not yet verified. And they verify through audit checks. And these are not their own audits. What they do is check the audit that was done by NOPD. And then full and effective compliance means that NOPD has incorporated the requirement into policy, trained everyone on the required policy. They've ensured that the policy, that requirement is being put into practice, And then whenever they find it not being done, they discipline noncompliance. That is what full and effective compliance means. Now, what if there isn't compliance? If there isn't compliance, then the parties can file a motion saying that there's non-compliance, and there will be a rule to show cause that there is non-compliance in the consent decree. The federal monitors can also issue a report highlighting non-compliance. So this say like happened with this happened in Seattle. There was a finding of non-compliance while they were actually in sustainment, and they moved out of sustainment. A section moved out of sustainment back into active oversight. This is currently happening in New York, for example, like with Reckers. Yes, they with their Department of Corrections. And again, I highlight Department of Corrections because a couple slides back, I said that we look to other similarly situated industries to see what happens with their consent decrees. One of the areas that we tend to look a lot to is prisons, because prisons have been under consent decrees for longer than police departments. And what we tend to notice is there's often a lot of growth, compliance, and progress while under a federal consent decree, and then a lot of almost immediate backsliding upon a release from a consent decree. And that's what shaped a lot of our science and a lot of our hesitancy that you've seen across the country with truly making findings of compliance and releasing police departments from consent decrees. A lot of that is kind of shaped by that jurisprudence and that science that's done around prisons, just because we haven't seen enough consent decrees in the policing space end. So again, whenever there's a finding of non-compliance, then in theory, if the court agrees with that, then they're going to issue an official ruling of non-compliance, and then they can decide to hold the party in contempt. If they hold the party in contempt, then they can add additional conditions to the consent decree. They could fine or sanction the police department or the municipality. They could extend the consent decree. They could extend the sustainment period. That, you can kind of make an ask. So again, this is the part where I said, we haven't seen a lot of cities get out of consent decrees. I wasn't exaggerating. You can see from these two columns, and I need to update this slide because we're no longer in 2022, but you can see from these two slides that there's way more cities entering consent decrees than exiting. I think kind of like as a people, we've gotten very good at defining a problem, but we haven't gotten very good at understanding what the solution looks like yet. And that's because, again, our understanding of a solution might be very, very clear. Of a problem might be very, very clear and easy to measure. But then the solution is a little bit more tricky. And a lot of that is because, again, we're trying to anticipate what the solution will look like by the time we get out. And that's a hard thing to measure. Technology changes, policing changes, and our culture changes. So it's very difficult to say what the end looks like. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, just like anything, money is real. And whenever there's something where there's money, you should assume that there's always going to be a question as to who's making money off of this, and does that person have an interest in seeing it end? So, always worth asking. But yeah, we have not seen a lot of cities get out of it. And the cities who do get out of it, I can't really say I would hold up as a model of what policing should be. If I could just say real fast, I'm a big fan of some of Yoko Ono's artwork, and she did one titled Imagine Peace, where she had a map of the earth, and she gave everyone who walked into a room a stamp that said Imagine Peace, and they were to stamp all the places that they wanted to have imagine peace, to be more peaceful. And she said that she thought it was a way to not just critique places that should imagine peace, but a way for us to talk about places that we don't think need to imagine peace, and to ask, why not? Similarly here, these are the places under consent decrees. So it's easy to point to them and demonize them and say, this is what a bad police department looks like, or this is problematic policing. But I can't really say that the people of Los Angeles or, say, Pittsburgh or Washington, D.C. are really pointing to their police departments and saying, this is what stellar policing is. We are happy. I don't really know if those people in those communities would say that they're happy, or would say that their consent decree achieved all the things they wanted it to achieve, or that they're done reforming their police department now just because their consent decree is over. So all of that to say, again, I think like consent decrees are held up as the great hope. And I just think communities are it, not necessarily consent decrees. So I just hope, we keep that in mind no matter what happens with this consent decree. So what will happen with our consent decree? If I was a betting person, I would say we're probably going to enter sustainment. So what does that mean? What's the sustainment strategy? Well, the sustainment strategy is a document that was co-written by the City of New Orleans, the NOPD, the Department of Justice, and the federal monitors. You notice that I list the NOPD and the City of New Orleans separately. Again, they do not always have the same interests that are in alignment. So sometimes they are both working on a document almost in conflict with one another. So they all had a chance to work on this document. Notice how I didn't say the community. That's because the community was not a part of this part of the sustainment strategy. You are a part of the public comment period. And the public comment period is our chance to also like critique the sustainment strategy and to ask for more, ask for different. The sustainment strategy includes topics like the scheduled monitoring of audits and reviews, the coordination of audits, how to handle violations of the consent decree or the sustainment plan. They have some requirements around corrective action strategies around the way that they report DV and sexual assault data, especially in light of the things we discovered in March that NOPD was underreporting sexual assaults. They also have a corrective action plan for GOAs, gone on arrivals, with domestic violence in light of a lot of the information that the city received after we found out that there was some very unfortunate murders after DV calls were left unanswered. It has a PIB audit schedule. It has sustainment plan deadlines, and it has a PCAP compliance plan. Now I put in it has that as in it has a page that's like left blank, and they're still working on that for how they want the police community advisory boards to look, because that's an area that is not in compliance and has not been in compliance ever. What is not included? Well, the PCAP plan, a community engagement strategy, clear language on how remedial action plans and corrective action strategies will work, and a commitment to local oversight. Those things are not really included. So we're going to go into a fairness hearing. What is a fairness hearing? I don't fully know yet. So the judge had a fairness hearing at the beginning of the consent decree. It was a chance for the public to kind of weigh in and provide some type of feedback on NOPD performance. Now, in theory, the federal monitors were required to do biannual public community surveys. And they were supposed to, like, the community surveys had three parts where they were supposed to survey NOPD internally, people who've been arrested and like incarcerated, and then the community who is not incarcerated, about police interactions and performance of the NOPD. They have not done a survey since 2018. So that survey was really a chance to do a temperature check and for us to be able to have some sense of normalcy in terms of our perspective on the police department. We don't really have that. So now we're going to kind of use the fairness hearing as a chance to be a temperature check, I guess. Now, we don't know how the fairness hearing is going to be formatted. We don't know if it's going to be a public comment model. We don't know if it's going to be like 2-minute limitations. We don't know if you need to submit in advance. We don't know if you need to be there in person. We don't know if there's going to be translators on staff. We don't know if it will be televised. We don't know if it will be held in the courtroom or if it will be held at a site like, say, Dillard. say hypothetically, I've been pushing this over and over and over again. Please, for the love of God, hold it in Dillard, because they have that huge space and the community can go. It can be televised. It could be broadcasted on the radio. But anyway, we don't know when it will be, how it will be formatted. And we don't know what value system will be assigned to feedback. So say Edith is able to successfully organize everyone in Eyes on Surveillance to attend, and say they self-identify as members of Eyes on Surveillance. Is all of that feedback going to be weighed as one? Like, all right, we now know the position of Eyes on Surveillance. Or is all of that feedback going to be weighed as 20 people who show up? Or say she's able to successfully run a letter writing campaign that submits over 1,200 letters to the Department of Justice. Is that going to count 1,200 times? Or are you going to say it's just all under the umbrella of Eyes on Surveillance? In which case, Edith would want to consider breaking up Eyes on Surveillance into many multi-part groups. So that way, the opinions of people aren't discounted as just, that's Eyes on Surveillance, that's what they say. So it's like, those are the thoughts that people might have going into this. We also don't know if this is meant to be an opportunity for people to be able to provide input into NOPD's compliance with the consent decree and the question of making a finding of moving into sustainment, or if it's meant to just color and inform the actual sustainment strategy. So we really don't know, because again, the way that findings of full and effective compliance were in theory to be made was through, if I were to go back to that slide, notice how it didn't say public input or public agreement. It was, did they do it? Did they put it into policy? Did they train on it? Did they, is it in practice? And do they discipline non-compliance, and can the monitor confirm it? There was nothing about public input. So for that reason, we really don't know. And then we really don't know, like, what is it, 10% of the final grade, 20%, 1%? We don't know. We don't know. I would love to know. And then what can the community ask for now? Hypothetically, what I've been hearing the community ask for is like a PCAP plan, maybe a switch to a partial compliance finding model, so that the judge keeps the areas that are still not in full and effective compliance, like PIB, who's still under a remedial action plan, or sex crimes, or say like PCABs and community engagement, or use of force, an area that's been ringing a lot of bells of alarm. Keep those under active federal oversight and move the other areas that have been in compliance, more or less, into sustainment. You could ask for a longer sustainment period than 2 years, in light of the fact that they're moving into sustainment without being in full and effective compliance. You could ask for a longer public comment period, so that way the federal monitors could complete their community survey. You could ask for an additional year to be added to address problematic areas of compliance. So therefore you could say, look, we'll do a traditional model, like sustainment period for all areas of the consent decree except for this. Let's do an extended sustainment period for the areas of concern. So they get like 4 years of sustainment instead of 2. So that way it's not active federal oversight, but we kind of keep them on the hook a little bit longer. Or we could, or like for the people in the room, you know, I never want to talk around the people who are like, Stella, you know, what are you talking about? The NOPD is fantastic. Well, for those people, you could try to push your ruling for on the motion to terminate the consent decree altogether. So there's a lot of things that the community can ask for right now. And I kind of encourage creativity, because again, this is new jurisprudence. This is new legal territory. We are treading new land. So why not? You know, people are looking to us as an example. Why not? Why not pitch it all? So the public comment period is until November 8th. You can email community.nola@usdoj.gov. That's the Department of Justice. You can email the federal monitors at aburns@consentdecreemonitors.onmicrosoft.com. And you can email the judge directly, well, the clerk@laed.uscourts.gov. And you can provide all your public comments. The public comment period is till November 8th as it exists right now. I'm pretty sure my next slide is simply questions, so I'll keep this one up. So that's my presentation. Any questions about any of this?
Hey, how you doing? You can hear me?
Yeah, go
Oh,
ahead.
yeah,
Yeah, that's Robert from OPD. How y'all doing tonight?
good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for the presentation. It sort of gave me an in-depth understanding of the consent decree. But one of the questions I had was, would you think it would sort of like be helpful if we can actually form some type of community coalition, in considering the fact that the consent decree may be gone, that we can sort of like put some plans together, because we're approaching a new mayor administration, right? And
Yes.
I think that we can maybe put some plans together, kind of like sort of like what we did with the DL coalition, sort of like put some things together. Not saying it's gonna actually be successful, but for the most part, I think that if we can get a more community buy-in, we can kind of maybe set a tone with the new administration that's coming in.
Yeah, you could. A community coalition, anything you can form is helpful.
Right.
And I think that's great. The only thing I will say is, again, I got worried when the federal monitor said that they're considering diversity of sources of information when they're looking at public comment.
Okay.
So if you're doing it for the purpose of trying to sway the court or trying to sway the federal monitor, then I would say, I don't know how helpful a coalition is, because they already said that, like, if you get 100 people in your coalition or you have 5 people in your coalition, they're kind of going to weigh that population the same. So it's like, maybe I would say, if you did that, except instead of a coalition, you had everyone sign on. So all the individual signatures are seen. Like, whenever you see like a plan and then people have like signature pages of all the people who sign on in agreement, that might be more impactful than titling it Coalition for Community Partnership for the Consent Decree or
Well,
something.
I was more in terms of speaking of the new administration, the new mayor administration. As you know, the mayor
Oh,
appointed the new police chief, right? And
right.
what I was saying is kind of like maybe it was kind of getting ahead of the curve, in the sense of considering that it may be done away, and that way we can sort of like have community buy-in as to how we, the community itself, expect the police to govern us without the consent decree. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's a
So
great idea. Yeah, no, I definitely do that. Definitely do that. The other thing I would say is that that's in theory what the PCABs are supposed to be as well.
right, okay,
And they're not like, so that's definitely an area that I think the PCABs need to get into, is this idea of how to handle administrative transitions, like the
right,
administration, the city hall transitions that happen, to
right,
ensure that like there's smooth transitions of power among different like shifts that might happen to police departments.
yes, yes.
But that's a great idea. Yes.
All right, thank you.
All right. We'll take some more questions. Stella, I think I remember from another presentation that right now do we have active PCABs?
So yes and no. You have PCABs in every district. However, they range from like 3 members to like 8 members. And some of them are like meeting regularly and some of them are not. So it's kind of all over the place. If you can email me to ask more about the PCAB in your neighborhood, if you want to know more, and I'll look it up and I'll give you some information, and I can even do like an email introduction towards the PCAB leadership that might be in your area. But I'm just going to be honest with you. Some of the PCABs are not meeting and are not very consistent.
All right, thank you for that. Are there any other questions at this time?
There are lots in the chat.
Okay,
Yeah,
Brooke,
just-
would you
I thought Val was going to, but I'll.
well, if Valerie is, I don't want to take
Yeah.
away. Valerie, are you handling the questions?
I guess not. Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm trying to.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm trying
okay.
to get to it. So I got a new device here, Brooke. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Shall I
okay.
start off with one right now?
Yeah, you can start off, Brooke, while I get myself together.
Okay. One question is, well, what I think you answered, what is the place for the community to voice their opinions on the progress? For Caroline, that was answered for you, right? And Valerie herself asked, what about accountability? Who will the police be accountable to?
the answer is going to be our office, the OIG. They're still going to have the Public Integrity Bureau. They're still going to ultimately be under the umbrella of City Council as well. There isn't going to be that federal voice anymore, though. And that's going to be particularly relevant for whenever there's state legislation that dictates how NOPD needs to police. Once we're out of the sustainment period, then that's going to be problematic.
Okay.
Okay.
Others, why are we losing so many police, and how can that be managed, do you think? Is that part of the consent decree?
Wait a minute, Brooke. Wait a minute, because I wanted Stella to elaborate on that, on my question for a minute, because right now we have which I'm finding out about, that when I want to say the state out of government is a public agency, it is hard for the employee or the I'm gonna say the customers or the client to report that agency to the federal government. That means that if this decree is removed, or I want to say downsized or liquidated, or however you all want to put it, how can the public, even the employee, be protected by the federal agency? Do they have to go to court and sue them? That means you spend more money, bringing hardship on both parties. You bring a hardship on the public, you bring a hardship on the employee. So who can me, like I'm a citizen, who can report them to besides you all? Do I have to go to court? Because it's very time consuming. Do I have to go to court and hire a lawyer, spending more money, which I don't have, to hold them accountable, instead of going to a federal agency for they have to submit to a federal judge?
So if you are you talking about if you experience police misconduct?
Yeah, it can be either one. It could be police misconduct, or what about if I work there?
Okay, so if you work at the NOPD, then most likely you are a civil service employee. You are most likely a classified employee, in which case, if there's a problem within the NOPD, then you can utilize civil service. You have civil service protections. If you do not have civil service protections, then that gets more complicated because this is an at-will state. So you still have, like, say, the Louisiana Commission on Human Rights and the EEOC, and they do work around employment disputes. So you would utilize them, but in theory, if you're an employee and you've experienced some type of harm, then yeah, you would most likely utilize those services or hire an attorney to bring some type of suit. But it depends on what your cause of action is. I mean, you could also, in theory, come to me and file a misconduct complaint, depending on, like, if you were terminated because of your race or something, then that might be grounds for misconduct. That might be grounds for a federal investigation for your EEOC rights. That might be like a legal ground to action where you want to hire a lawyer. So it really kind of depends. The consent decree wasn't really used for that purpose anyway. So the exit of the consent decree isn't going to change my answer to that.
Okay. Okay. What about if I'm a citizen? It'll be harder for me to report the police to the federal government because they won't be under the federal government guidelines anymore. It won't be, they cannot won't have to report to the federal government, correct?
So if you're an everyday person and you have a police encounter, again, I would say you should go to my office or to the OIG or to the Public Integrity Bureau, depending on what type of issue you've experienced with the NOPD, to file a misconduct complaint. And all of those things were already in existence now and didn't involve the federal government. The federal government isn't really looking to get involved in individual matters. Like the federal government wasn't reviewing their officer-involved shootings. They weren't reviewing their uses of force. Like all of these individualized things, they really weren't looking at. They were looking for pattern and practice issues. So they were looking for like patterns, systemic issues. They're not looking for the one-offs. So as like an everyday person, you really weren't going to be utilizing the federal government's services for police misconduct that much under the consent decree anyway. You were going to be utilizing the other things that are in place that are going to remain. But again, all of that could change because the federal government really just ensured that those structures were there. Now, when they leave, will those structures change? That part I can't answer. Like right now, for example, in Columbus, Ohio, if you are beaten by a police officer and you want to file a misconduct complaint on that, you have to go within a certain amount of time to file your misconduct complaint. And you have to sign an affidavit stating that everything you said is correct. And they have the right to put you under a polygraph test to determine that what you're saying is truthful. And if in the end they decide that you didn't get beaten by the police or that you filed a false claim or that they just simply disagree with your claim, they then reserve the right to charge you with a crime for filing that misconduct complaint. That is an example of a place that has really not created the systems and the infrastructure to allow for the open engagement of the community with their police department to disclose misconduct. You've basically made it impossible to disclose misconduct because people are going to be very scared to go in if they have to sign an affidavit and they have to do a polygraph test. That's insane. So those are the things that could potentially change if we don't have a federal consent decree here saying, no, you have to take complaints. You cannot put your complainants through that type of rigmarole to be able to file a complaint. That's the stuff I worry about. Those are the ways to chill police oversight and police accountability without eliminating it. Because Columbus is walking around saying, oh yeah, you can file complaints against police officers. Yeah, come on in. You just have to boom, 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 boom. And that's the worrisome part.
Yeah, it's a form of intimidation. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, why are we losing so many officers? That was the other part of the question. That's a tricky one. Some people will blame the consent decree. Some people are going to blame, truthfully, like administration, both City Hall and NOPD leadership. I will say that a lot of our officers that are leaving for what they think are the greener pastures of like St. Tammany, Jefferson Parish, Kenner, or St. Bernard Parish, those aren't going to be so green soon. The feds are circling them. So these other cities, these other parishes might also be under consent decree soon, or might be targeted for pattern and practice investigations by the DOJ and the FBI. We know LSP already is. So we see a lot of officers leave to go work in those other places and then come back when they realize like, oh, wait, this is kind of just the way that policing is naturally evolving. They would have to go out of state somewhere where there's like collective bargaining to really be able to get like a truly different experience.
Brooke, you want to go on and
Yeah.
ask your other two questions?
Oh, okay, there's
The
apparently
higher rank.
the higher ranking police are still getting more of the promotions. Is that also true?
So the question is are higher ranking police officers still getting
Still getting proportionally more promotions. I just read a thing in the paper saying that was pretty recent that said that was still a problem, that it
yeah,
was not
well,
fairly.
that is not being done fairly. So
Yeah.
promotions is always a touchy subject. Right now, like on Friday, the Police Association of New Orleans and the Black Organization of Police, they joined together to file a motion to the Civil Service Commission to ask for a formal investigation into the promotional process that was recently froze by Chief Kirkpatrick and the mayor. And that was for captains and majors. So the promotional process has historically been an area where there's always questions of how much subjectivity is being utilized and how are candidates being scored, and are they being scored in such a way where now recently we're now seeing a return to some of these racial based allegations, but previously we were seeing more about favoritism. So it was more about like an in crowd, out crowd type of dynamic.
Yeah.
And that some people are like the rising stars and they're popular, they're the in crowd people, and they're just getting touched for better opportunities, for better specialized departments and divisions. But you know, it's hard for me to answer. I will
Yeah.
say that like the Louisiana Constitution did envision that any type of promotional process might be challenged for fairness, and that's meant to be investigated by the Civil Service Commission. So I would like to see the Civil Service Commission conduct a thorough investigation into the promotional process. And if I could be totally honest, I have a very unpopular belief on promotions where I say they should be subjective. And a lot of people are very uncomfortable by that reality. But I think it's insane that we're going to act like we don't know who these people are who are applying for promotions. I think that's crazy. They are going to walk into a room and I'm going to pretend like I don't know what they've been accused of. And I don't know that they previously violated their probation last time they were a captain and they were demoted back down to lieutenant. I'm going to pretend like I don't know the types of things that they've been accused of and the types of things that they've done in the community or failed to do in the community. I think that's very worrisome. I also think it's deceiving to make this decision based on job performance evaluations, because I think it is very human for us to know how to please our supervisor, but I think it's very difficult to please your peers on the same level as you and your subordinates. And I think it's a real missed opportunity that they're not surveying peers about, are you a good working partner? And subordinates, are you a good boss, a good supervisor? Are you a fair leader before they make these promotional decisions? And the other thing is, I think it's outrageous that they're not surveying the community on who could potentially be the future leadership of their districts and their department. I think that's insane that we're considering promoting district captains right now without asking PCAB leadership, has this district captain ever worked with you? Have they ever gone to a PCAB meeting? Have they swept your concerns under the rug? It's like, I think the community should weigh in, and I think their peers and their subordinates should weigh in. So yeah, I mean, if it was up to me, I would probably move it to a significantly less subjective,
More
objective
subjective.
level.
Yeah. And I think it certainly in nonprofits, it's becoming more so that your subordinates now judge you as well.
I think it's a helpful tool because, you know, I think there's a lot of people who keep moving up because, again, they're good at pleasing who's above them,
Right.
and they're horrible to the people beneath them. And I just don't think that's very fair. And that's true of every industry. But I think that's very important in policing because you need to have strong leadership, and culture ends up getting set at the top. So you
Unless
should-
there's retribution among the ranks if they,
yeah,
you know.
there definitely is. And and the other thing is, if you're scared to do that because you're scared that your employees or your peers are going to weaponize those systems, then that's your answer. You have a department that is willing to act in a way that is worrisome. Maybe then you don't have the progress and the culture changes that you think you have.
Those are hard to pull out though, too.
I know. Culture changes are really hard to achieve.
The other thing, my last thing is, I know we're getting close to time here, but my last thing was I beg that that NOPD, which they announced in the paper, that they were taking credit for a reduction in crime, but that is happening all over the country. I mean, it's
Right.
not here, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, it's everywhere.
Yeah. So
it's everywhere. And also a consent decree is not a crime prevention strategy.
No.
Consent decrees and crime, sometimes those are happy companions, but sometimes they're actually not going to influence one another. We don't
Right.
have enough science to definitively say. I'll just say that like your goals in crime prevention and your goals in policing in a way that's going to be community centered might not always be the same. And I also will say that like there's a difference between crime prevention and clearing of crimes through effective law legal investigations. So it's like, reducing the number of crimes can be done through a lot of different ways. Like, for example, I today could reduce carjackings by coding everything in as car theft. Boom, I just solved your problem through the power of data. So you have to be very mindful of how you're doing that type of work. And that's why I say clearance rates might be more beneficial than like crime reduction rates. Because you might want to say, all right, the police department might not be the best tool for crime prevention anyway. It's community organizations, faith-based groups, groups that work with children, groups that works with families, housing-based groups, education, all of those things. We know too much about how complex communities are to say that law enforcement is what keeps us safe or prevents crime. It really isn't. It's what responds to crime. So I would look to like how quick are response times, how effective are those investigations, are they getting cleared, and are the arrests actually resulting in convictions, or are you arresting the wrong people? And are those convictions then getting overturned? Because if they are, then we're still not doing it right.
Okay,
Oh,
hey, Brooke.
Yeah.
I see a question in the chat that Betty has, and that's
Yes.
a very important question to me. Betty, you want to ask your question, or you want Brooke to read it?
No, I'll just ask. I noticed when you had your map that the Louisiana State Police were listed as consent decree. Did I misread that?
Yeah, I think that was so they are not under the consent decree. So under paragraph 8 of the consent decree, if I enter into a memorandum of understanding, or if I hire a law enforcement agency to be my contractor to do work for me as a party of the consent decree, then the consent decree applies to all of my contractors. But the Louisiana State Police have complete jurisdiction over anywhere in the state. So they can go into any municipality and they can police. They just historically haven't been as present in New Orleans for a lot of different reasons. Now they're coming in on their own, jurisdiction, and technically they're allowed to be here. They're not bound by the consent decree. But if we had asked them to come in here, if we had made a request like what we did back in 2016, 2017, when we had the memorandum of understanding for them to police in the French Quarter, that at that time I would have argued that they're bound by the consent decree, but now they no longer. No, there's nothing. They don't have to answer to us at all. I asked them to do a public forum with our office, and their response was, "We don't do that." And I was like, "No, you don't." That's why I'm asking for you now to.
Okay.
So what about the issue of the use of force data that was also in the paper today.
So Verete did a very good article, I think, on the use of force data, which I would highly recommend looking at. We have disputed use of force data, and by we I mean universally you will see police oversight dispute use of force data with police departments all over the country. For one, we don't share a common definition of use of force at all. So in some cities, it is not use of force to go hands-on. It is not use of force to point your gun. That's just considered policing. It's only a use of force to say fire it. And maybe it's only a use of force to strike someone with that bullet, not to fire it and not injure anybody. So it's like, we need, like, that's an area where if I like quit this job and I was allowed to lobby, I would go to I would try to lobby federal legislation to have shared definitions of use of force, because I think us not even defining it the same way is worrisome. Like, for example, we don't define use of force the same way as LSP. So we can't even compare, we're not comparing apples to apples here. So that's problem one. Then entering into, okay, now we have this definition of use of force. How do we count? That's where it gets really tricky. So NOPD says that we double count our subjects of force. So the people that are involved with force, they say we double count them. And we would argue that we are accurately portraying the amount of force that happens against them. So I'm a white person. Somebody uses force against me. They hit me in the face, they point a gun at me, and they tase me. I then, when you are counting how many uses of force happen against white women, I would say that you should count me 3 times. You should count that a gun was pointed at me. You should count that a taser was used against me. And you should count that I was struck in the face. They would say that you have effectively tripled me. I'm one person and I've been tripled. So they would say you should say that use of force was used against one white woman, me. There just happened to be multiple incidents of force. So by doing that, you are going to, I would argue, you are going to drive down your number of use of force against our African American community, because I would argue that the data shows that they use more force and they escalate faster with the African American community than they do with the white community. And our data is totally messed up if you don't fall under those 2 easy buckets visually. Like, they don't ask me about use of force against Asian Americans, South Asian, anyone of any type of Latino culture. Don't, because the data is just going to be missing. So I would say you're undercounting, because you are now saying like, oh, we used force against one Black man. And I'm like, yeah, but you use like 5 types of force against this Black man. So I feel all 5 types should be counted as their experience. And they would say that I counted him 5 times. This is going to get like more complicated if I'm in a group of people. So if I'm dating someone and my dating partner is a different race than me, or my dating partner is the same race as me, then it's going to also get murky about like, how do we count these 2 different encounters? Like if they point the gun at all of us, those types of things. They would also argue that you should look at like consistency of force used against, say, we'll use carjacking as an example again. They would say, well, we use the same amount of force against somebody who's white, who's accused of carjacking, as someone who's Black, who's accused of carjacking. The problem here isn't the force that we're using against people. The problem here is the force that we're using against carjackers. We're not looking at race, we're looking at what you're accused of. If we go in hot because you're accused of murder or carjacking, it's because you're accused of more severe crimes. And so the, like our response might be bigger or whatever. But that also could have a racial leaning, because the chances of a white teenager, say, joyriding in their neighbor's car, listen to how I'm talking about this. A white child joyriding in a car. That sounds so innocent, so sweet. That's just unauthorized use of a movable, or maybe car theft. Now imagine it's a Black teenager. How are we going to talk about that? Are we going to use the term joyriding? Are we going to talk about it differently? Are we going to be more likely to upcharge? maybe use more intensity or severity when we're talking about that offense? Are we going to use the term carjacking? So like the crimes that we pick might be colored by racial issue, like racial bias, inherent bias, or favoritism, or my ability to relate with a white teenager who just, is being a teenager, but my inability to relate with a Black teenager who I think is being violent. There might be something there, and that might. So that's why I say, like, I don't like the idea of comparing carjacking to carjacking, just because I think even the crime itself might be racially motivated to label someone as a carjacker. So I think, I don't like that argument.
Thank you, Stella. We thank you for coming. Our time is first spent, but it was well spent. Thank you for the facts and this information. This will be spreaded out. Believe you me, we're going to spread this information out because it's good. So in your closing remarks, do we have any, I'm going to say, candidates here or any announcements? Will you please get your announcements ready? But Stella, in your closing remarks, can you tell us, will this benefit us, or it would be negative or positive for the consent decree to, I want to say, go away? In your opinion, in your neutral opinion,
I was hoping you would not ask me that.
Okay. I didn't ask you that.
Yeah.
So can you give us a closing remark and tell us about what we need to do, need to focus on?
I'll say that innovation in policing is it's sky high, and it's up to the community to power it. And I will say, if you are waiting for federal monitors or the federal court to be innovative, you will wait forever. That is not where people are creative. That's not where people take chances. And that's not where true change happens. So I would say it's up to us to push innovation. And a lot of the innovation that I see in policing, like mobile units of social workers responding to mental health calls, utilizing community-based restorative practices and mediation in lieu of arrests or in lieu of police interactions, or to stop police interactions, like all of these things, those are outside of the consent decree. Like getting communities into rooms, maybe live streaming disciplinary hearings or use of force hearings. That's stuff that consent decrees never imagined. And those things are happening here in New Orleans or in other places that are not under consent decrees or are not required to do it by consent decrees. So I say that there's going to be a lot of opportunity to do a lot of exciting and imaginative things that are truly going to benefit our community. And those are the things I'm going to choose to focus on, no matter what happens with the consent decree.
Thank you. You keep up the good work. You're doing a good job, Stella.
Oh, thank you.
Announcement? No announcement? Okay, come on, Belinda.
Hey, Valerie, I've been sitting here listening, and this has been really good, a lot of good information. I just want to thank you for putting on this forum. It's been very educational. I'm hoping that we can have a follow-up though, because I do have a lot of questions on what we can not just do here and what's happening in New Orleans, but also in the host across the state.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the lead persons were on this here was Marissa and Richard. Thank you, Richard.
Oh, thank you, Arissa, and Richard. You always do a great job. Thank you all for putting this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we have no candidates, no announcements. So we about to close out. Brooke, am I missing anything before we leave out with a positive thought? Okay, y'all. Tomorrow's vote.
Can we also get the contact information, Valerie, for the speakers tonight? Did they put their information in the chat?
Yes, I'm
Yes,
doing.
She about to do it now.
Thank
So
you.
tomorrow's voting. So please tell your neighbors, your families, your friends, to go to the poll and vote. So that's right. We have no enemies tomorrow. We're telling everybody to go and vote. So with that said, we gonna I'm trying to get this information myself. So we're gonna pause for 30 seconds, quiet our spirits, our spirit, our mind, and our soul. Thank you, Lord, for this glorious night. You bless us to come together where we can learn, for we will be better and productive in our daily lives. We ask that you protect us and you keep us in your care. We ask that you bless our families and our friends with your protecting arms around us. Provide for us continually, we ask. We pray, Lord God Jesus, on tomorrow that when we call it a voting day for tomorrow for the United States, we ask everybody and everything be peaceful. Everybody respect one another. We ask that you be there, and whoever win, Lord, that you bless us indeed, still with your guidance. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Stella. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your hard work.
Thank you. Thank you.